All right, I'll keep monitoring the waiting room. I think in the interest of bandwidth, it would probably be helpful for folks to stay muted and to leave your video off, at least for now. But I want to welcome everybody to the workshop this morning, and thank you for spending time with us this morning. Just to give you some sense of kind of how the days start. My day started about 6 o'clock checking on new lambs in our lambing paddock this morning. So I think I'm fully coffeeed up, but in case you see me yawn, you'll know why. A couple of housekeeping things real quick here. We are recording this webinar, and so it will be posted on my YouTube channel when we're done. If you've got any questions about that, do let me know. But we want to make this available for folks that may not have been able to make it today. If you have questions as we go through this morning, you can put those in the chat pod, and we'll try to get to those as they come in. We'll try to get to as many of the questions as you all submitted as we can. I don't know that we'll have time to get to all of them, but I will try to answer all of them through a blog post in the next week or so. 90 minutes is a long time to look at your screen, especially when you have to look at me. And so we will try to take a break as we get through this as well. Want to make sure everybody has the handout that we sent. That'll help kind of with some of the terminology that we'll be talking about today as well. And with that, unless there are any questions, I think we'll start with a couple of quick poll questions just to find out who's on this morning and what our backgrounds are. So let me launch those, and we'll give you a couple seconds to respond. Want to know who you are and kind of where you live or work. So if you take just a few minutes to answer those questions, that would be great. All right, I think we've got everybody except those of us who are speaking has voted. So we'll end the polling, and it looks like we've got a great contingent, I think, primarily from NRCS this morning. So thank you all for joining us. A handful of state and local folks, a couple of educator researchers, which is outstanding, nonprofit folks, and we've got 6 ranchers on here this morning. So in addition to the folks that are on the panel today, I'm hoping that those of you who are also ranchers can offer some insights as well. In terms of where folks are, we've got a predominantly from the Sierra foothills in Sierra Nevada, but also folks from the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys, other places in California, and a couple of folks from outside California. So welcome and thank you. And I think we'll dive right into the presentation to get started, unless anybody's got any questions. Let's see here. All right, can everybody see that okay? Joe, can you see the slides all right? Okay. All right, so real quick, I want to start with just a real quick introduction as to who I am. And as you can tell, I'm a bit follically challenged, so I wear many different hats. I am the Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor with UC Cooperative Extension here in Placer, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba counties, and also serve as the County Director for Placer and Nevada. My research and extension programs are focused on ranch profitability, range and pasture management, and then livestock and predator conflicts. I'm also co-owner of Flying Mule Sheep Company here in Auburn. We run about 100 commercial ewes on about 230 acres of rangeland and 25 acres of irrigated pasture. And we market lambs and wool on an annual basis. And I will point out that two of our panelists, myself and Greg Lawley, are wearing wool this morning. So gotta rep the product while we're here. So I want to start this with really talking about why ranching starts with grass, and then we'll talk about nutrition and reproduction as it relates to grass production. We'll go through a quick discussion of stocking rate and carrying capacity and how that relates to grazing systems. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about the business of ranching, and then we'll get to our panel at the end. And again, if you have questions as we go through this, if you want to put those in the chat box, that would be great. All right. So when we think about grass here in the Sierra foothills or the Sacramento Valley or even the High Sierra, we have a variety of different types of forages that ranchers take advantage of. Annual rangeland are the unirrigated hillsides here in the foothills or in the valley that many of us think of as kind of iconic ranch land. And that's probably our predominant source of forage for ranching in this region. We also have irrigated pasture, and we'll talk about how that's related to the forage calendar in terms of annual rangeland. There are a number of producers, primarily sheep and goat producers, to take advantage of crop residue or crop stubble, alfalfa or grain stubble, in the Sacramento Valley during certain times of year. On the west slope of the Sierra, as many of you know, there's a significant amount of what we would call brush range that is a forage resource. We also have mountain meadows in the High Sierra, and as we get to the east side of the region, we've got sagebrush steppe rangelands. So we've got a really diverse diversity in terms of our types of forages. But from the standpoint of ranching, these plants really vary in their nutritional value and palatability. So by palatability, we mean how desirable they are for livestock to graze, and that's somewhat related to nutrition. We've got seasonal variation, and kind of the rule of thumb is that green forage is typically higher in protein and energy than dry forage. And so that green forage resource is really important in terms of feeding livestock. And then we've got a great deal of species variation too. We've got grass versus broadleaf plants like clover or vetch or some of our weedy species versus brush, which can also be a pretty significant forage resource for a lot of folks. So one of the things that we can then think about in terms of those forages is who actually owns the grass. Most commercial ranches operate on a combination of owned and leased land. And there's a section in the handout that really describes kind of how that looks. Our own operation is fairly typical of a small sheep operation. We own virtually none of the land that we graze. So we're operating on other people's land. Flexibility and value really vary by ownership. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind from an agency or an NGO perspective as well. So if you've got owned land, you absolutely control the forage on that landscape. You have control over when livestock are moved on or off, and you have a significant amount of control. Private leased land, you may have a little less control in terms of what the lease requires, but you may have pretty significant flexibility in that regard. Typically, we find that public leased land, whether it's a grazing allotment on BLM, Bureau of Land Management, or Forest Service land, or any other public leased land, we have slightly less flexibility in terms of utilization and grazing dates and so forth. And then if we're getting paid to graze, if we're doing targeted grazing for a specific purpose to reduce fire danger or to control weeds, we have much less flexibility. And really there's a spectrum of flexibility that goes from that paid to graze at the bottom end to land that you may own as a rancher. So why is flexibility important from a ranching perspective? We talk a lot about adaptive capacity when we're thinking about livestock production, and flexibility is really the key in terms of adapting to climate variability, and really increases the value of a grazing lease. That flexibility is really crucial from a ranch management and business management perspective. So some of the things that give a rancher a little more flexibility would be on or off dates on a lease that are flexible depending on forage conditions, on the vegetation goals on the property, on a variety of other factors. So rather than looking at the calendar, we're looking at the on the ground conditions. Stock water and development and storage are absolutely critical, as we're finding this year, and I'm sure that our rancher panel will talk about this. But there are places right now here in the foothills that we can't put livestock on simply because there's no stock water for the livestock to drink. The ability to adjust the numbers or classes of livestock, so add or subtract numbers, or if it's a lease for cows and calves, to be able to add heifers or add stocker cattle, depending on forage availability, adds to that flexibility. The lack of public access creates more flexibility for a rancher. So if you're not having to worry about gates left open or about potential conflicts with recreation, that can add to flexibility for folks as well. And then lack of hard and fast utilization requirements. Now, there certainly are on our rangelands some standards that we try to manage towards in terms of leaving residual dry matter. But those are things on a more flexible situation that we can address on a year-by-year basis. Less flexibility comes when we have specific on or off dates based on the calendar rather than on the ground conditions. So if a lease calls for cattle to be there December 1st every year, and we haven't had a germinating rain, that can create some challenging issues. Total reliance on natural stock water sources like creeks or ponds can be problematic in terms of stock water availability. Can also create, depending on the settings, some water quality challenges for us as well. Hard and fast restrictions on the number of livestock. So a lease that says 100 cows and calves every year, no matter what the conditions are on the ground, reduces flexibility. Public access, as we talked about, creates a situation where there's less flexibility for a manager. And then those strict utilization limits can reduce flexibility as well. Now, in terms of forage preferences, there are several rules of thumb that we look at in terms of what cattle versus sheep versus goats like to graze on. Really, cattle prefer 80% of their diet to be grass and maybe 20% of their diet generally to be broadleaf forages. Sheep are a little more balanced in that regard. It's kind of a 50-50 split in terms of grass versus broadleaves. And then goats are more of a 20 to 80 split, just the opposite of cattle. If you look at how sheep graze, they will tend to prefer to graze things that are at head level down towards the ground. So that's kind of what they're going to look at as a forage resource. Brush that's much taller than sheep, they're probably not going to utilize much. Goats prefer typically to graze or browse from head height up. And so you'll see goats kind of climb into the brush and eat some of those higher leaves in a brush stand. All of that said, livestock don't read the books. And so there's a lot of individual variation in this as well. There is some pretty solid research that suggests that young animals learn to graze by observing their mothers, and even some evidence that suggests forage preferences may begin to form in utero. So, if a cow or a ewe or a goat is grazing some specific type of forage while carrying her offspring, those forage preferences may begin to form at that stage even. So part of the question then becomes, will the animals eat it, and is it good for them? Does it meet their nutritional needs? As fiber and lignin content in a plant increase, the palatability decreases. And if we think about what our annual rangelands look like here in late May or June, as those plants mature, set seed, and then die, that's a time frame during the year when that annual rangeland is increasing in terms of fiber and lignin content and decreasing in its desirability in terms of feeding livestock. We can manage this with supplemental protein and energy to help get livestock to digest that dry grass. But really, this is why ranchers follow the green. This is why many ranchers go from annual rangeland in the winter and spring onto irrigated pasture or onto mountain meadows in the summer months, because that green forage is much higher in nutrition and much more palatable to the livestock. This is kind of a historic publication that was done by Mel George and a colleague at UC Davis many, many years ago. But as plants mature and then become leached, they're going to decline in terms of their forage quality. And by quality, what we're talking about is their ability to meet the nutritional needs of the livestock that we're grazing on those landscapes. Another way to look at this, and this is kind of our forage calendar and our sheep operation. This would be similar for a cattle operation, except for the production cycle, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But if we look at the energy available on annual rangeland, this yellow curve shows us that if we're lambing in March and April, we're able to meet the nutritional demands of our sheep simply from that annual rangeland during that time frame. Let me see if I can use a pointer here real quick. But you'll also notice over in this July through October, November timeframe that we're not going to be able to meet the nutritional demands of our sheep, these blue and red curves here on annual rangeland. If you think about what our hillsides here in the foothills look like in October before we've had a rain, it's almost entirely dry grass. And so we're not able to meet those needs at that point. If we add irrigated pasture to the mix, however, we push out the peak production a little later into the spring, early summer. We do tend to have a slump on irrigated pasture here in the hottest part of the summer, but then we get a little bit of rebound in terms of productivity and nutritional value in the early fall as the days get shorter and the nights get cooler. So if we put these two things together, which many of us do in our operations, we can meet the nutritional requirements of our livestock by combining this annual rangeland forage resource with summer irrigated pasture, or in some cases, mountain meadow pasture as well. A typical year for most of the operations here in the region would be to be on annual rangeland now, and we'll hear about that from our rancher panelists here in a little bit. If you've got small ruminants, sheep or goats, and it's been dry like it's been this year, you may be on alfalfa stubble at this time of year. As we go into the spring and early summer months, we'll see people transition onto irrigated pasture. In the height of the summer and into early fall, typically we'll be on irrigated pasture or on mountain meadow rangeland, and then transitioning back to annual rangeland in the fall, depending on when we get germination. One thing that I would point out, and there were several questions in the registration about prescribed grazing. This is kind of our window when we can do a lot of fuel load reduction with targeted grazing, and it's primarily with sheep and goats, and there's a reason for that. That's not to say that cattle can't be used to manage fuel load, but one of the things that we really have to look at in terms of nutritional intake is what our reproductive cycle is. And why that's so important for cattle is that reproductive cycle drives nutritional demand. So the highest nutritional demand that a cow or a ewe or a doe will have will be during that last trimester of their pregnancy and the first 1 to 2 months of their lactation. A non-lactating female, a dry cow or a dry ewe, will consume about half to 2/3 of the amount of forage that a lactating female needs. And that's really important in terms of our ability to do some of these other things that we try to do with grazing in terms of fuel reduction and weed management. The critical nutrients for livestock obviously are water. Protein is really critical in terms of feeding the microflora in a ruminant's digestive system. That protein allows all those bugs to digest the cellulose in forage and convert that cellulose into essential fatty acids. And so we think about protein in terms of maintenance, growth, and lactation, which I'll cover in just a second. And then energy is also really important. And energy is what animals use to produce milk and to produce fat, which is essential in terms of a meat product as we're talking about meat quality. An animal kind of prioritizes its nutritional needs. And so if we're at a kind of a base level of nutritional intake, that animal is simply going to be maintaining its bodily functions. It's going to be maintaining metabolism, but not able to do some of those higher priority things. It takes more protein and more energy for an animal to grow than it does simply to maintain. And so growth of young animals, development of young heifers, for example, is going to take a higher protein, higher energy forage resource than simply maintaining a mature cow. And then lactation is the highest nutritional demand, as I indicated earlier. And really at that stage, we're going to have the highest quality forage that we can have available to us in order to produce enough milk and maintain all those other functions for the animal. And so why size matters in terms of this regard is that cattle are pregnant for 280 days. So if you're in the business of ranching, the way that you make income is to have as many cows as possible produce a calf every year. And in order to do that, a cow has to start her estrus cycle after giving birth within 80 days. If we're going to try to get that cow rebred shortly after she's had a calf, she's got to start cycling, which means she has to be on a rising plane of nutrition at the same point where she's got her highest nutritional demand. And that's where it can be really difficult to push cows nutritionally when they're trying to nurse a calf and get rebred. Sheep and goats, on the other hand, are pregnant for 150 days. And so we've got a greater window between weaning and breeding where we can push those small ruminants nutritionally on lower quality forage because they're simply maintaining body function. They're not trying to grow and they're not trying to lactate. And so we've got that longer window when we can use them to do some other things. So why would you decide when to calve? Why would people calve in the fall versus the spring? Why would people lamb in the fall versus the spring? And there's a couple of considerations that ranchers think about when they're establishing that production calendar. Forage availability in terms of quality and cost by season is one of those factors that ranchers look at. Profitable marketing windows are another consideration. So one of the reasons that we see in the valley a lot of sheep producers calving or lambing in the fall is that they can finish a lamb on grass in the springtime when the rest of the country doesn't have lambs available. And so they're really trying to fit that market niche. By the same token, a cattle producer that wants to wean a calf straight off of annual grass in the springtime may decide to calve in the fall at a time when maybe the forage quality needs to be supplemented. Any questions at this point? We'll pause here if there's any questions you want to put in the chat real quick before we talk about stocking rate and carrying capacity. All right, so our job in terms of stocking rate and carrying capacity is really to match the supply of forage with the demand that our livestock have. Carrying capacity will vary by season and by year, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means in more detail. But our stocking rate, or our demand side of the equation, also varies, and that varies by production stage. So our pairs, which we refer to any lactating females as a pair, whether they've got one calf or two lambs, will have a much higher demand and result in a higher stocking rate than the same number of dry cows. And then feeder animals will also add to that stocking rate or demand. And there's a chart in the handout that I sent that talks about how we measure that in terms of animal units. Now, in terms of annual variation in carrying capacity, that really has to do with precipitation, timing of precipitation, temperature of both the air temperature and the soil temperature in terms of our total forage production. So if we have a year like we had several years ago where we've got just astronomical forage production, that might be a way that we would want to bring in stocker animals or feeder animals to take advantage of that high production in that particular year. If we're in a year like this, where it doesn't look like we're going to produce as much forage as we would expect in a normal year, we might aggressively call our animals to balance our stocking rate with that lower forage production. And then every year we can think about how many replacement females we're going to retain. In an exceptionally dry year, we might not retain any heifers or ewe lambs. In a year that looks like we've got good production, we might retain more and make up for those dry years. Now, in terms of seasonal variation in carrying capacity, this really has to do with, again, that forage quality and palatability question. And so there's several ways that we can think about that. We can match our high demand time frame with that high supply. So in our sheep operation, we lamb in late February and March because we're matching the time frame that those ewes have their highest demand with the time when we're going to grow the best grass at the cheapest cost. We can also think about stockers and feeders during the green season, or if we've got a lot of irrigated pasture, using stockers or feeders to use that excess forage as well. A really quick note about overgrazing, because I think this is a term that gets confusing sometimes and gets used inappropriately. But it's really important to remember that overgrazing is a function of time, not livestock numbers. I think all of us have probably seen the horse pasture with one or two horses in it that's absolutely denuded of vegetation, has nothing growing in it at all. And so that's really not a function of having too many horses. It's a function of how much time those horses spend on that particular pasture. Overgrazing can occur in two basic ways. First, we can stay too long in a particular pasture and allow the animal to get a second bite of a plant that's already been grazed before it's regrown from that first bite. And what happens in that case is that we're removing those solar panels that allows the plant to recover from the initial grazing. And we're requiring the plant to draw energy reserves from its root system to regrow. And if we continue to do that over time, we'll actually diminish the root system and we can, in effect, graze that particular plant or class of plants out of a pasture. The second way that can happen is when we come back too soon, where we may have rested a particular pasture or plant, but we don't allow it to fully regrow, and we get a second bite of that plant at that point. Which brings us to this conversation about grazing systems. And this is a question I get a lot, and I'm sure that our rancher panelists get questions about grazing systems frequently as well. So all grazing systems, whether it's a set stock where you're just turning animals out at the beginning of the season and gathering them at the end, or whether you're doing a rotational grazing system where you're moving animals frequently, all of those systems have to start with matching the carrying capacity and the stocking rate. Despite what may be claimed about rotational grazing, that's kind of a fundamental rule that we can't get around, that if we're overstocked, no amount of grazing management is going to fix that system. There is some research that suggests that these rotational systems that really focus on resting plants during the growing season can provide a marginal increase in carrying capacity. And that number, from my experience and from some research that was done at the UC Sierra Foothill Research and Extension Center, suggests that we may get a 20 to 30% bump in our carrying capacity if we are resting pastures during the growing season and paying attention to that recovery phase. The thing to keep in mind with that, that I think kind of gets lost in that discussion often, is that these kinds of systems are often more labor and capital intensive. They're going to require more in the way of fencing or more in the way of labor moving livestock than a set stock system. And so there are trade-offs involved in using those grazing systems. This research that was done at Sierra up at Browns Valley also showed some really interesting livestock performance differences. So in this trial where stocker cattle, steers, were grazed in a rotational system, they found that over the course of 3 seasons, they actually had lower individual weight gains. And so that question of 20 to 30% bump in carrying capacity, as Rob answered, would be, yeah, over the grazing season. So if you're talking about annual rangeland, it would be during the growing season that we'd have that 20 to 30% bump in our carrying capacity. Thanks, Rob. What we did find in this research was that if we measured weight gain in the cattle grazed per acre, that we had more weight gain than we had in kind of the season-long set stock situation. So more pounds per acre grazed, but individual performance declined. And we did see that slight increase in carrying capacity on those rotated pastures. I think the bottom line for me, however, is that if we're using this rotational system, we're probably also really paying attention to the amount of forage ahead of us in our rotation. And in our sheep operation, it really gives us the ability to be flexible and to adapt to those seasonal and annual changes in carrying capacity. We're always looking 6 months down the road. Come the end of the spring growing season, we're already thinking about how much grass we've left to come back to in the fall. And so this type of grazing system does give us some flexibility in terms of adapting to those challenges as they arise. Moving on to the business of ranching, because I think that's one of the key takeaways from all of this, is that this is a business. It's not a recreational pursuit. The 3 ranchers that are on our panel, and actually all the ranchers that are with us today, are taking time away from their business to be here this morning, and there's ramifications to doing that in their businesses, and I think that's important to acknowledge. If we think about getting started in ranching, there's a whole variety of capital investments that a rancher needs to make. Breeding animals, if we're in a cow-calf situation or a ewe or goat situation, we're going to have to buy that productive unit, and can be a significant capital outlay. We'll need to invest in some sort of fencing and infrastructure to manage those animals. We will need equipment, whether it's 4-wheelers or trucks and trailers or squeeze chutes, in order to safely handle and manage those animals. If we've got irrigated pasture, we're likely to have to invest in irrigation infrastructure, even if it's simply doing things like pulling ditches or pulling field checks. That is a capital investment. Pasture or rangeland renovation or planting is also a capital investment. Many of the irrigated pastures in our area are only planted every 10 or 15 or even 20 years. And so that can be a significant investment when it has to be renovated. Things like dogs and horses that help with the work that we do with livestock would be part of that capital investment as well. And then I throw land in here with a question mark, because I think one of the real challenges in our particular part of the world is that land is valued at far beyond its capacity to produce forage. And so it can be often difficult to justify going out and buying land to start a ranching business at a particular scale. And we'll come back to that here in just a second. The sources of ranch income for most folks would be the sale of market animals. For most cow-calf producers, that would be a weaned calf. It would not be a finished animal. And similar in many cases for sheep and goat producers. We've got the sale of call animals. So a ewe or a cow that doesn't produce offspring in a particular year, or that may have other behavioral issues, we would be selling. Wool or fiber is a source of ranch income. There are a number of folks in the region that are selling grazing services now, and that can be a really significant source of income, and may actually make the sale of those market animals more of a byproduct of the grazing service. There are ranching operations that generate income from hunting and other recreation opportunities. There are a handful of folks that are selling meat, and we'll talk a little bit more about why this isn't more widespread here in just a few minutes. And then the operations that do own land may generate income from the appreciation of those assets. And there's a couple of mechanisms that people can utilize to recognize that appreciation, most notably through the sale of development rights as a conservation easement. In terms of costs, we divide the costs when we're looking at analyzing the economic viability of a ranch into direct or variable costs and overhead or fixed costs. Our variable costs are those costs that go up or down depending on the number of animals that we're operating. So those are things like supplemental feed, like veterinary costs, which would be treatment and vaccination. Things like ear tags and those types of things that we're using for livestock identification. If we're marketing through an auction or through a video sale, we're paying a commission on every animal that we market. And there may be others that are variable in particular situations. Our overhead costs in a ranching setting are primarily associated with land and labor. And so the cost of owning or renting land would be a primary overhead cost. We've got to pay that cost whether we have one cow or 1,000 head of cattle on the property. Irrigation water would be another overhead cost that doesn't go up or down with the number of livestock that we've got. Typically, we look at labor as an overhead cost, and obviously, as you step up in terms of the numbers of animals, you may have more labor requirements, but that really is an overhead or a fixed cost. And I'll get to this question in the chat here in just a second. Herding dogs, guard dogs, horses are all labor components, and that would be an overhead cost as well. And then repairs and maintenance would be an overhead as well. So what are the costs and benefits of registering livestock? And we'll get into that with a question to our ranching panel. Really, registered livestock are only those purebred, only pays for a purebred producer. There's not a registry for commercial crossbred sheep, for example. And that really depends on the market that you're trying to sell to. And that'd be a good question for Joe as we get into this in just a bit. So we're all going to go in the cattle business just to kind of illustrate the idea of scale here, because I think that's it's an easy thing to miss in terms of this whole discussion. So we're going to go into business, but we've got a few assumptions that we're going to have to deal with as partners. We have no money, so keep that in mind. We have no extra time. All of us are working. And we have no land. So we don't own the land that we're going to graze. Just a few minor details here. So if we're going to do that, we're going to need to borrow money to get started. And that money comes at a cost that we pay in terms of interest. We're going to have to go out and lease some land in order to run our cattle on it. And then we're going to have to hire somebody to take care of the cattle. So all of those things are overhead or fixed costs. We haven't even purchased a cow yet, but we've incurred all these costs. And as I said, that's primarily land and management labor. And if you see here, even at no cost sold, we're still going to have to pay land rent. We're going to have to pay our manager, and we're going to have to pay the interest that we got on the loan that we received to get started. So then we've got cows turned out. We've bought the cows and we've got these other expenses. So we're going to have to buy a little bit of supplemental feed for them. We're going to have to pay a vet. We're going to have to buy vaccines and pay those veterinary costs. We're going to have to buy some ear tags. We're going to have to pay some marketing costs eventually and interest on the cow loan. So those are all our direct or variable costs. So when we have no calves to sell, we don't have any extra cost above our overhead. But as we move out here, say this is 100 head of cattle that we're marketing, we've got higher costs. Now, we've turned the bull in with the cows. In 18 months, we're going to have a weaned calf to sell, provided everything goes as planned. That's absolutely time for celebration. And we've just sold that one calf. Have we made any money yet? Things are still looking a little bleak. So what we've got to do is actually sell more calves. And we've got to figure out where our point of profitability is. So this, you'll hear ranchers talk about their break-even point. They may talk about, it costs me a certain number of dollars per cow to operate for a full year. And so that cow's got to return more than that in order for me to be profitable. We absolutely don't want to be in this red zone where we've experienced a loss. And we're really trying to be over here in this green zone where we're generating profit. And I think the key takeaway from all of this is that there is, for every ranch, this kind of scale question that comes up. How big do I need to be in order to be in this green area where my total revenue covers all of my costs and generates a profit? For some operations, that may be, in our case, we do that on a part-time basis with 100 ewes. Excuse me. For somebody else, that may be 500 mother cows, depending on how their business is structured. So a couple of notes about full-time versus part-time ranching. And I think as we were talking this morning, I'm going to steal something from Joe. I think part-time ranchers who take it seriously treat it as if it's a full-time job. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But there's some research that was done at Davis that suggests, on average, a commercial cow-calf ranch needs 500 mother cows per full-time hired employee. Now, if it's smaller than that, that would typically be family labor that's taking care of the cattle and taking care of the operation. But for one full-time employee, that 500 mother cow threshold, I think, is probably pretty reasonable. On the sheep and goat side, most of the larger scale operations calculate that they're going to need a band of sheep or goats, which would be 1,000 to 1,100 ewes or does per full-time herder in order to justify that labor expense. Targeted grazing operations, and I think Rob Thompson is on this morning as well, will have greater labor requirements and as a consequence may hire employees at a smaller scale, kind of around that 400 to 600 head level. Real quick, just to go through a few of the challenges that ranchers often talk to me about and that I think are really important to keep in mind here. First and foremost would be drought, and that's certainly on everybody's mind this year. I think from a rangeland perspective, we really think of drought as a climatic water deficit. So it's not just a lack of rain, but it's a lack of soil moisture as well. What we're seeing this year is that we haven't filled the soil profile yet, and so we don't have runoff, which is a really critical stock water component in our annual rangelands. And these types of droughts are felt, much earlier than they might be in crop agriculture. So if you talk to a rancher, they were talking drought as opposed to maybe an almond grower who's concerned about summer water deliveries. And I think that's a critical distinction to make. There are a number of proactive strategies that ranchers use, one being Um, Setting a conservative stocking rate. Don't fully stock the ranch so that you're saving some grass in case the grass doesn't grow. What a lot of us do is really bank the grass that grows in the springtime for coming back to in the fall. And there's a real tension there when we're talking about fire danger, and that we're trying to save grass that may be a fire threat in the summer and early fall, because we're not sure when the grass is going to germinate in the fall and give us more grass to graze. In terms of our reactive strategies, these are things that start costing us money. So things like purchasing supplemental feed, maybe weaning calves or weaning lambs or goat kids early and selling them at a lighter weight, getting less of a paycheck because of that. And then maybe calling more heavily to reduce the demand that we've got on our forage resources. Wildfire is a huge issue. I imagine some of you read the accounts that Dave Daly wrote of having lost so many cattle in the Bear Fire this last summer. From a kind of before the fire perspective, I think a lot of ranchers are really concerned about strategic fuel reduction in defensible space, and then doing planning to be able to address the during fire issues that many of us are concerned about. In many cases, a commercial ranching operation is not going to be able to evacuate in a short time frame. The logistics of getting trucks or getting trailers in and getting livestock loaded in a fast moving fire situation mean that we're probably looking at sheltering in place. Human safety is also a big concern, and then having some access to provide feed and water during an emergency to animals that were sheltered in place. Access, it remains important after a fire, but then we're also dealing with trying to replace that lost forage if it burned up. Many times we're also having to repair fences or other infrastructure that may have been impacted by fire. We're working on a program here in the foothills, and really there's an effort statewide that the California Cattlemen's Association is focused on to provide some sort of pass to provide ranchers access during emergencies like this. Jeff, looking at your question return in terms of economies of scale, X number of livestock, et cetera. Every ranch is going to have a level of profitability that they're comfortable with. Our goal in our sheep operation is that for every dollar that we take in income, we want to be able to generate 20 cents of profit. Now, some operations may have a higher profitability target, others may have lower, but that's kind of the benchmark that we use in our sheep business. All right, predators are another issue here in the foothills and really all over California. And one of the drivers for this is that as we fragment these rangeland landscapes and as we have more development or intensified agriculture, we're really concentrating predators and livestock on the same landscapes, which sets us up for some challenging issues potentially. We also, as most of you probably know, have several predator species that have special protection here in California. Mountain lions are not endangered under either the state or federal Endangered Species Act, but they are specially protected. And now we do actually just this week have another gray wolf that's traveled into the eastern part of Nevada County. Gray wolves have state protection under the Endangered Species Act. These kinds of protections have a bearing on the types of tools that we can use to protect livestock. So in some cases, we do have the ability to lethally control problem predators. But really increasingly, a lot of ranchers are looking at non-lethal protection tools. And certainly in sheep and goat business, we've had to rely on these types of non-lethal livestock protection tools. And I'm going to look at a question here real quick. All right. The last challenge, and I've asked the ranchers on this webinar to speak to this as well, is this kind of regulatory maze. And I think This word cloud came from a paper that my colleague Leslie Roach, who's the range specialist at UC Davis, did in 2015, really looking at what ranchers told her were the things that they were concerned about. And regulations were the primary factor there. From a rancher perspective, these programs can often be complicated. They can be confusing, sometimes can be conflicting. A kind of a classic conflicting regulatory program is the air quality regulations that may restrict burning in some cases, and the desire of CAL FIRE to do more burning to manage fuel load. But there's other conflicting regulations that folks have to deal with, and I think that's a challenge. And then lastly, I do want to talk about value added. I know a number of you had questions about whether additional processing capacity would help make ranches more profitable. And as you've probably noted now, by the time we get to this slide, the short answer is it's complicated. It really depends. It's not simply a question of processing capacity. So none of the ranchers on the panel, nor I, currently sell meat. And it's not just because of the fact that we don't have a local processor. We did sell meat in our business. We sold about 100 lambs a year through farmers markets for about 5 years. And what we found was that we had significant costs after we finished a lamb, that we had all the additional processing costs, and probably more importantly, from my standpoint, the time commitment involved. In order to sell those 100 lambs a year, I had to spend about 20 hours a week at farmers markets, and I also had to do additional work to process and store that meat. And so in thinking about my time commitment, that was a real consideration as well. The other fact is that most ranchers are not currently producing a finished animal. We'll talk to the panel about this. In our operation, what I'm selling is a weaned lamb. Those lambs probably need another 90 to 120 days on feed before they reach a finished weight. And I'm not structured currently in terms of my forage resources to be able to do that. So even if there was an option here locally for me, I'd have to totally change my production system in order to sell meat versus selling a weaned lamb. There's also the fact that as everybody's trying to market their own product, we're also duplicating all of those other things at the individual level. So every individual rancher is hauling to the processor. Every individual rancher is renting cold storage to store their meat products. And so there's some inherent economic inefficiencies in kind of duplicating those things at a small scale. And then lastly, I think it's kind of easy in this case to say, well, it's the regulations that are making this problematic. It's the regulations that are driving small processors out of the business. Even the large processors that have excess capacity find custom processing for a whole bunch of small scale producers is really economically challenging. And, I think that's one of the factors involved here, that meat processing has even thinner margins than ranching does. And so it's difficult to get people to invest in that as a business. Let's see. It looks like Joe answered a question in the chat. Let me just look at this. So I think we'll talk about the USDA inspected processing. I think there's some possibilities of doing something other than USDA inspected at a small scale. Right now, there are exemptions for poultry producers and a small exemption for cattle producers to this inspection requirement. There may be some opportunities to look at that in more depth as well. We still get down to this economic issue for the processor, and I think that's more difficult to overcome. And with that, I would like to introduce our panel, and I do want to acknowledge that we've got a couple of other ranchers on the call today too. And if you guys have answers to these questions, feel free to chime in. Our panel today includes Patty Beard, who operates Beard Ranch here in Auburn. Patty was raised on a dairy here in Placer County and went to Chico State. She's had a cow-calf operation here since 1977. And as everybody on this panel is, she's very active in terms of the community. She's a board member of the Placer County Ag Commission and serves on the RCD board as well. Joe Fisher of Bruin Ranch is another lifelong foothill rancher, comes from Calaveras County. Bruin Ranch is a purebred seed stock Angus operation, and Joe can tell us a little more about what that entails. He and his wife, Abby, have 4 children. And then Greg Lawley operates Lawley Ranch in north of Lincoln here in Placer County as well. Comes from a ranching background and has worked in the industry his entire career, including a stint with the Department of Food and Agriculture and the Bureau of Livestock Identification. And Greg and his wife, Karen, have a commercial Angus herd and sell some grass hay. And so with that, I'd like to start with this question for our ranching panel, and maybe Patty, if you could talk about what kind of are the big days in your operation, the days that take the most planning and effort and have the biggest bearing on how your year goes.
Oh, what a question. Every day is a big day. I think the days that take the most time for me are during my irrigation season. And that starts in April 15th, NID turns the water on, Nevada Irrigation District. I have about 40 acres of irrigated pasture here on Bell Road, and I buy 16 inches of water to irrigate that 40 acres. I may stray a little bit in my explanation of what's going on with my operation as well, and I'm sure that's okay because I'm giving you all an idea of what's going on. My irrigation bill this year probably will be in the range of $6,500. That is one of my largest costs beyond insurance. And that cost is what determines how much longer I'm going to be in the business. So even though our water costs here in Placer County in the foothills is relatively low compared to the rest of California, when you're irrigated pasture, it is very expensive. But getting back to the time spent irrigating 40 acres, some of it's flood irrigated, some is on an irrigation pump. Some is by gravity. Basically twice a day, I spend close to 5 to 6 hours irrigating. So that takes a lot. That's a lot of my time during the summer months, irrigating from April to October 15th is when the water is turned off. From that point on, then maybe a few weeks of not too concentrated work, and then I start moving cows onto dry ground and also supplementing with hay during a couple of months of the year.
Thank you, Patty. Joe, kind of talk through what some of your big days are and what that entails.
So what's really funny, Dan, is Patty stole my response. I think if you'd asked this of a bunch of producers 5-10 years ago, they would have said branding or vaccinating or pregnancy checking females or shipping to the mountains or gathering from the mountains. Those have almost become the easy fun days, to be frank. It's every day that's difficult. And I was just thinking through some of the things Patty was talking about with irrigation and what it means to be foothill irrigators, different than valleys with checks and solid sets and things like that. It's a very specialized, and even when you have solid sets, and Greg can touch on this a little, it's a highly specialized skill of which we can't pay specialized level money to have an employee do. We've had employees where let's say in the day when minimum wage was about $8, we'd be paying more like 14. And today we'll pay our interns a little bit more than that. And we enjoy having interns and watching them learn and grow. But our full-time employee would be much north of that. And then all the other costs associated with that. And when you have 5 to 6 hours of their day just socked in basically the chore of the mundane that is irrigation, it's a huge expense to our operation. But for me personally, my biggest day would be our bull sale every year. We run a purebred Angus operation, and so it's sort of like a grass-fed beef program, but in a different kind of a way. We almost, in terms of a business, have to buy our animals from ourselves at weaning, add commercial value, and then we add value onto them by making them older and selling them as a bull. We still have those animals that wouldn't qualify breed candidates that would sell into traditional markets. Once our bulls actually are deemed a breeder, our break even is about, I would say, close to $3,500 to $4,000 depending on the year. And it looks really, really good on a sale report when we average about 6,000. But when you start talking about an $80,000 pickup and you start talking about employees that make 50,000, and that sounds like a lot, and actually they're not doing well, they're just enjoying their job and living their life. There's not a lot left at the end of the day. The bull sale would take most of my time, and it's from a customer service perspective, dealing with people all over the country, a lot of phone time, a lot of windshield time, a lot of figuring out what folks need in terms of genetics and service. But I would say that the most difficult days are every day, just the mundane of ranching and the weight. And it doesn't say difficult, it says big days, but it's the weight of not being able to leave too that gets difficult. We can't train people to just step in. It's no longer get the neighbor kid to feed the horses and the dog. It's we've become so segmented in our operations and how we're spread out across the foothills to run a sustainable sized operation. It's hard to train people to take care of all those animals. So we don't get away a lot. And so in essence, we are choosing a very expensive lifestyle.
Thanks, Joe. Greg, how about your operation? What's some of the big days for you?
Well, I'll have to go ahead and echo what Joe and Patty said. Irrigation does take up a lot of time. My irrigation that takes up most of the time is getting started early in the season when we first turn on the water. Everything has to be checked. All the sprinklers have to make sure that they're in working order. And so that takes up a lot. I'm a little different than they are. I think that one of my big days is marking calves, because that's about the only time that I really require outside labor. And by outside labor, it's usually family labor that I get in touch with that will come and help me. Because that's the one thing that is hard to do without outside help. Most of the other occupations and things that I do on the ranch, I can do by myself. I can usually move the cattle by myself. I can do all the irrigation. I can also vaccinate and all those things. But marking seems to be one that takes more help than any of the others. And as far as the job, I think people that are in the cattle business have to like the cattle business. Otherwise, it is work. I mean, it is hard work. No one wants to. I'm sure sheep industry is the same way. But we all are doing this because we like the cattle. We like doing the work. We enjoy being around the livestock. And so that makes it much easier, because it does take a lot of time. It is hard to be able to get away and not think about the ranch that you've left behind. And that's one of the difficulties, is just always being worried that something's not right at home when you're not here.
That's a really, really good point. You know, that's this time of year, my day starts and ends with checking on lambs. And even when I'm not out there checking, you've always got that in the back of your mind that, gosh, I hope everything's okay. It's not something you can just walk away from. So Joe, I'm going to start this next question with you, I think. If you were looking at two similar pieces of land that you could lease, what would make that lease more or less valuable to you in terms of its fit in your operation? What are things you look at?
First, I would say productivity. And I think it's because our operation is a little bit different. We have a really docile set of cattle that are used to being moved, used to being handled, and we're scaled to a size of which we have employees for help. And so in terms of infrastructural improvements and things like that, we're a little bit more flexible than a lot of operations, but definitely forage quality and topography. And you can get into some of these areas where the soils get shallower, and all of it has a value, but on a per acreage basis, that would change. And then number two would be your flexibility scale. I really love that slide that you showed, Dan. If people are willing to work with us, and that's been hard. It's hard with new landowners. It's hard with new land managers or different ones. It's been difficult to try to express the knowledge base that comes with the operation and how long it takes to learn a particular piece of ground, and that flexibility to the right operation means a lot. And then also, I can take off this hat and put on the agency type hat that I've been involved with stuff in previous life and say, I'd absolutely understand that some of the flexibility could cause concerns for the wrong producers. But flexibility for us means a lot, because that means it allows us to unlock all the tools that we have of managing properties the way that we want, managing our livestock the way that we want, and what we think best fits our operation.
Greg, how about you? What are some of the things you look for in a piece of leased ground, and what makes something valuable or less valuable?
Well, actually, I've been very fortunate in that I actually have been leasing the same property since 1978, although it's gone through several owners. So for me, I haven't had a lot of experience with other leases other than with this one piece of property. I was leasing it from the original owners back when in 1978, and then it was sold, and then the last sale went to Placer Land Trust. So for the last probably 20 years or so, I've been leasing from Placer Land Trust, and for me, it's been communication with the trust. They have been excellent to work with. I think we have a very good rapport, and whenever we have any issues that may arise, we can sit down and talk about them and work those out, and have had no issues. So I think for me, what makes it important is communication with whoever you're leasing from.
I think that's a hugely important point that's easy to leave out of the equation. That ability to work through questions has tremendous value. Patty, how about you? What are some of the things you look at in terms of lease value?
I look at location. I want a lease that's fairly close to my home places. And I also look at geographical area. I've had one lease of a ranch in Lincoln, 80 acres down on the Auburn Ravine. And I've had that for probably 26 years now. It's got a barn on it, so I can put up to 20 ton of hay in that barn, and for supplemental feed in case I need it, or if I have a problem with cattle, I can have them right there at the corrals, which is easy for me because I usually don't have too much outside labor to come in and give me a hand. But as far as grass coming on, I can count on grass coming on in the middle of February at the Lincoln Ranch. As I move up the hill, I have leases in the Baxter Grade, Mount Vernon area. That grass comes on more like middle of March. And my grass here in off of Bell Road is late. The feed doesn't come on until the end of April. So, but it lasts, of course, until the end of May, 1st of June. So those are some issues I look for. I also look for, I've had opportunities, people have come to me and said, will you lease some of my ground? But the fences are completely shot. And I don't think a lot of the absentee owners or people that are not actually in the business but own land understand that we've got to have fairly good quality fences if we're going to be putting our cattle into some of these leases. So infrastructure would be also something that I'm looking for.
Patty, I think you've just had some experience with that. What's a mile of good barbed wire fence cost to have built these days?
Well, I just purchased, I sold a conservation agreement or a conservation easement off of the ranch here, and I reinvested the money in, stupid me, invested it in another ranch. But that's okay. I love ranching. I love preserving open space. And anyway, I purchased another 80 acres. And this was a old ranch, abandoned ranch. Fences hadn't been worked on probably 50, 60 years. Wooden cedar posts, all that sort of stuff. So I actually hired a fencing company to come in. And it's hard to give you a price per mile because what they ended up doing was actually pulling old fence out and going in and cutting a new strip. In other words, the brush, the trees, overgrowth was tremendous on the boundary. So we actually had to recreate an open space before we could rebuild that area. So all in all, for about 80 acres of perimeter fencing on 3 sides and then hot wire, 4-strand hot wire around the houses, it amounted to about $42,000. So not everyone can go in and do something like that. I was very fortunate to do it, but again, I'm unusual in that I was willing to spend that much money on fencing.
Thank you. I think that's helpful to kind of put that in context. It's not just as easy as running out on a 4-wheeler with a roll of barbed wire and a fence pounder.
No, that was all done in high tensile strength barbed wire, hog wire to keep the wild pigs out, and steel posts, 2 5/8 inch steel posts every 5th post. In other words, T-posts in between. And it's stout. It's there for a long time.
Greg, I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about this processing question that always comes up and is a real legitimate question. But in your operation, what would you have to change in order to start selling meat versus live animals? Walk us through that a little bit.
Sure. I think if I needed to do that, a couple of things I would need to do. First of all, I would need to change when I would be receiving income, because if you're no longer going to be selling that weaning, you're going to delay your income. You're going to have some type of infrastructure to feed those animals, especially if you're going to be doing it on a year-round basis. So you're going to have something that can get them out of the mud, whether it be inside of a barn or on a cement pad. You have to have some storage capacity for bulk feed, because you could no longer afford to, I think, buy it at the local feed store. So I think those are the things that I see would be what I would need to change. And probably one of the reasons that I haven't really looked at doing that is because I don't see that as you mentioned earlier, I don't see that the profitability is there to make those investments for me.
Patty, what about you? I know you've done a little bit of direct marketing, but what would change if you started focusing on meat versus selling live animals?
Well, there would have to be a local processing plant, because I ended up hauling my steers over to Orland for processing to be a USDA inspected. So that was 2 trips, haul the cattle over there and then go back and pick up the meat and bring it back. So it ended up not being cost effective, like you indicated, Dan. When you're working, taking care of everything else on the ranch, it's hard to spend that time running back and forth. Plus, it's difficult to find a market that where someone wants to come in and actually buy half a beef or a full beef. It's quite a bit of money to put out. So you do have some people that can do that, but it's limited. Your demand is limited unless you're willing to take the time like you did and sell at a farmer's market.
And I would just add, we started looking at our business as if the meat business was buying a finished lamb from the ranch. And I found that all of my profit was in raising the lamb, and I added virtually no profit to the meat business by the time I paid for processing, storage, and paid my marketing time. And so it was not an area that added value to what we did. Joe, how about you? I mean, you've got a very different business model to begin with, but what would change in that regard?
So I just wanted to say I was trying to type to Zach in the chat box, and I'll touch a little bit on that, Zach. I'll just, my operation is different. I have 18 steers this year that got kept over, and they will be marketed in some sort of direct-to-consumer fashion. Haven't fully decided what that is yet. If we step back and get a little bit global, I'll tell you guys that I have a really good relationship in my bull selling business with one of the larger grass-fed beef operations in the state. And we have genetics that work in that realm, and we've cooperated on different things before and will continue to do so. It's really hard to tease out all the costs associated with a cattle operation. And then when you add on a layer of further processing, you know, was your pickup fully full of diesel when you took off to Orland, or had your spouse taken it for groceries? And how much fuel are we really using here when we stopped at your high school kid's friend's house on the way? It's still an $80,000 pickup that really, however you slice it, if you own a diesel pickup, the pickup alone, not insurance, not tax, not licensing, we figure costs our operation about $1,000 a month. And when you look at a pretty decently scaled cattle operation and you say that they're maybe netting $100 to $150 a calf, it doesn't take long to make that go to zero. I heard something really sadly said the other day by a very, very big producer in the state, arguably the largest in our region, said, you know, we had good years and bad years in the cattle business, but we never really made a lot of money on cattle. We made money buying and selling ranches. And I hope it hasn't come to that sad reality, and I hope that things are changing for us. And I'll circle back, Dan. I see you getting nervous. I have a history of that, guys. Sorry. Local processing can be very good for people with cattle that don't fit. And what I mean by that is I think there's some low-hanging fruit, especially on our cull cow market. We've been just hammered with all sorts of, I don't want to use words like fraud or collusion, but if I could use words that weren't those but meant the same thing, the packer industries are absolutely ruthless right now. And when cull animals realize about 20% of our annual income, and that's been completely hammered. And when I say cull, it's a cow pasture exhausted life, useful life operation, then usually they would go into like your casino steaks or ground beef or things like that. If we could take a cow there that is worth anywhere from $300 to $500 on our operation and make her worth $1,000, then sure, that's absolutely going to help our bottom line. And we've actually heard a lot of our commercial producers saying the 10% number. If I could direct market 10% of what I produce and raise that gross margin on those, then that's fine. I think that where it gets sticky, and Dan could talk to this, we don't need to make it a lesson in economics, but we almost need to sell ground beef for $20, $25 a pound for this truly to work. And I think that most folks who are well-intentioned and wanting to know where their products come from have a point at which the economics no longer work for their family either. Frankly put, conventional meat systems are incredibly efficient. They're incredibly well scaled. They're spreading those costs over hundreds and hundreds of thousands of units, and they're able to get tight margins. And so we have a really cheap and safe food supply. So local is not fully, it's not fully realized the value of what we're producing. Add to that the quality of forage that we would be grazing. Dan said something a while ago where he was talking about individual animal performance. In the actual Sierra foothills, grass finishing systems are really difficult to do. Most operations that thrive are in more valley or coastal regions where they have higher quality forages, and we could not move these cattle fast enough in a rotational grazing system in order to put on the exterior and internal fat needed to produce a saleable product. And maybe you can sell it to your neighbor, maybe you can sell it to your friend, but to get scaled up to run a real and legitimate business, I just think it's rather daunting in our area.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, Joe. I think that's the challenge in finishing any animal, is to get that degree of finish that will make a quality product too. So I know we're coming up on 10:30, and I believe Joe turns into a pumpkin right at 10:30 today. So I will ask our panel by email to answer that question about regulation, and maybe we can maintain your anonymity. So we don't throw anybody under the bus about a particular regulation. But Patty, I'd like to maybe have you start to wrap us up with what you hope the key point about ranching that you would hope folks would take away today. What do you want people to go away with today?
Gosh, I really enjoyed your presentation, Dan. I'm impressed. First time I've seen it, and I think it is just super valuable for anyone interested in getting in the cattle or livestock business, whether it be cattle, goats, sheep, whatever, that they can certainly learn a lot from that. And my hat's off to you for that presentation.
Wow, thank you very much. Joe, what do you hope folks take away from this?
Well, I'll try to not take too much more time because you guys all know I'm windy, but can I address the regulation one? I kind of put something together with regulation. It's a little bit more holistic that I was thinking is we have a pile of really well-intentioned regulations that put burdens on us. And I've been in those legislative offices where an elected official will look at me and say, what is the regulation you want me to change? And I don't have a good answer for them. So let me just give you a good example. Burning in Placer County, we all know the issues and fire hazards right now in these foothill communities and how difficult it is to remove vegetation and make safe and defendable spaces. Placer County, first of all, there's restrictions. I need to be careful on this one. So I'm gonna just kind of ad lib a second here, but it's encouraged to not have wood burning fire stoves anymore. And I know that that's in the whole Sacramento region, and it has been for quite some time. And frankly, at one point in the Sacramento area, I think it was a couple years ago, air quality they were really concerned about. And there were like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you could burn if you were on a certain schedule, and Tuesday, Thursday. And this is to heat your home. So what we've done is we've just robbed Peter to pay Paul, because now there's piles and piles of dry wood places that can't be burned. And so there's no market for it anymore. When I was a kid in high school, I'd sell wood for $300 a cord. It's how I made some money. It was how I was going to be my first millionaire. And what I found out is I was really good at failing businesses, because that was one of them. But I started a fire here in the fall, and actually in trouble with a neighbor because everybody's hypersensitive with fire. And it wasn't a burn day. And why was it not a burn day? It wasn't a burn day because Placer County decided to make an ordinance that we wouldn't have burn days on holidays, because it's when most folks had days off and they would like to enjoy the outdoors. So another well-intentioned regulation that is keeping us from doing the right thing. Our window to burn vegetation on these landscapes is getting tighter and tighter every year. I'm already nervous. Yesterday when we had the wind blowing and it was 70 degrees, I'm going, man, I don't think I can start this set of berries on fire that has been encroaching on this particular system. So I say all this to just say that there are a lot of well-intentioned laws that end up putting burdens on us. And as cattle ranchers and as livestock producers, traditionally, all of us that treat it like a full-time job or do it for a full-time job are rule followers. That's just what we are. We aren't the renegades out there like using DDT because we have some left over, or guys that are going to burn without a burn permit or burn on a non-burn day. It's just, I don't know how to better impart that to all of you, but just whenever you talk to your elected officials, I think that it's important to be aware that there's always unintended consequences of many more of these regulations. What I hope folks take away from this is that there are ranchers, and I'd say it's the majority of them, that really truly care about their environment and community around them and the greater ecosystem, and really are just trying to carve out a lifestyle. And we don't make a lot of money. We work hard, and we aren't asking for anything from anybody for that. We know what we're getting into. But yeah, that's kind of what I've got. Thanks for including me. Fantastic presentation, Dan. And I'm shocked. I've participated in a lot of Zooms, and I haven't seen one with 63 participants that have stayed this long like this. So thank you, guys.
Thank you, Joe, very much. Greg, what would you hope folks would take away from today?
I think what I would hope is that the people that are viewing this would understand that as ranchers that we are very interested in sustainability, and that we are cognizant of the habitats in which we run cattle, and we do want to be good neighbors with the people that have an interest in that. But I also want them to understand that that this is a business and that we need to make sure that we are profitable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm answering one last question in the chat. I will make the slides available. Let me just finish this real quick and we'll wrap up. I want to thank everybody and especially our panel for participating today. I think it's really helpful to get your perspectives on these issues, and I really appreciate you sharing your approach to it. And I want to thank everybody who was able to attend today. I think it's helpful to start this conversation. I really hope that we could do this on somebody's ranch before too long, that we'll be able to do some more in-person things. So thank you all. I will let you know when the talks are posted, and I will also be sending out a post-workshop survey to get your evaluation of what you learned and what we could have done differently. So thank you for spending time, and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.